Subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Instagram, and join our Facebook community for epic weekly giveaways. What's up, Airsofters? You know, Airsoft is one of the great hobbies that transcends national borders. It's an international hobby that is enjoyed by players of every age group, play style, and interest. A decade ago, the world watched as California politicians sought to unfairly limit access to and enjoyment of Airsoft right here in California in the United States. And now, Airsoft is potentially under attack again by politicians, this time in Canada. Known as Bill C-21, the proposed legislation expands upon recent real firearm legislation to include imitation weapons, which unfortunately include Airsoft. So to find out more, to support the cause, and ultimately to give you Airsofters the most information possible, we brought in our expert. Our expert, who also happens to be from the Great White North, one of our favorite Airsofters in the world, and a very good friend, Robo Murray. Robo, thanks for joining us.
Matty, buddy, it's always good to talk to you and the Evike crew. You do me great justice by saying expert, although I think that's a letdown, buddy. So.
Don't be ridiculous. You're our actual expert on this, not only because you're from Canada, but also because a lot of the work that you do is involved with and revolves around real firearms and their legislation. So I would say of all the Airsofters coming out of Canada, you're probably closest to having your finger on the pulse of what's going on.
Sure, and I would agree with that. I mean, I do have a nice perspective of that middle ground between both parties, right? So
Right. So in order to keep this video succinct, let's get right into it. What Bill C-21 is a sizable bill, and it has mostly to do with firearms. In fact, there's really only one section that kind of pertains to Airsoft in a roundabout way. What is Bill C-21 overall? And then we'll get into the kind of the line by line description of like where Airsoft is being affected here.
Yeah, sure. So, the biggest picture I can give on C-21 is it's to your point, what you said there was, it's a massive bill. And it really is a supportive bill of last year's, what's called an order in council, effectively laws passed that banned a bunch of semi-autos up here. So it's a bill to start supporting that. Okay. So it's changes to classifications of firearms, right? So definitions of those things. So when I say the definition of replica firearm, that's where the Airsoft portion comes in, right? Like previously, Airsoft lived in a space, and it actually wasn't just Airsoft. It's what's called mid-velocity air rifles, okay? They lived in a space between 366 and 500 feet per second, and effectively the clause in C-21 eliminates that space. It essentially says if it's not a real gun by Canadian standards, i.e. you need a license for it, it's now a replica firearm if it looks like a real firearm.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but leading up to this, in order to import an Airsoft gun into Canada, it fall within that 360 to 500 FPS. Is that correct?
Absolutely. So any American retailers who service Canada will have, Evike's a perfect example of this. You guys literally Canadianize our stuff to send it up here. And a lot of cases, what that means is that retailers are having to, swap out springs to make them shoot, close to 400, because that's the safest place to have them import into Canada. Because if it ever fell under 366, upon testing by our border guys, it would be classified as a prohibited item because it's a replica firearm, right? One might argue, like, Rob, that doesn't make much sense.
Right.
Yeah, most people are going to be like, Rob, that doesn't make sense because what do you mean, like a safer thing? It becomes illegal the more safe it becomes. It's not about that, right? It's about, things over 366, that mid-velocity range, could do things like kill squirrels or whatever. So there's a place for that to exist with a purpose. The only purpose, theoretically, a replica firearm has in the hands of a citizen, from the perspective of most Canadian governments, is, well, then obviously they're going to use them to rob banks. So they might as well be illegal, right? So it's sort of that sort of idea. And again, that's where this C-21 has affected Airsoft. It has really nothing to do with Airsoft. It has everything to do with the changing of that definition of those classifications, and Airsoft becomes a drive-by target by default, right? And I shouldn't say just Airsoft. I mean, we're talking mag-fed paintball falls into this. Okay, like again, the change is if it doesn't shoot over 500 and above. Okay, that's important, and above 5.7 joules, okay, which is every single Airsoft gun on the face of the planet. Okay, nothing meets that metric. it means they're all prohibited as replica firearms now.
Or
would be under C-21.
And for those airsofters that want to follow along with kind of what Robo's referring to, in Bill C-21, under Section 84, you're looking at the byline 3.1, 3.2, and specifically A and B under 3.2. That's kind of what we're referring to when Robo's talking about the 5.7 joule limit, or the 152.4 meters per second, which is really 500 FPS or so.
It's about 500 feet per second. I'm just making it more common. For us as Canadians, the meters per second is what applies.
And the key here is it's not projectile specific. It doesn't say paintballs or airsoft guns or BBs. It says any projectile firing. So it's really not just airsoft that's being attacked here. So the paintballers need to get on board with finding out more information on this just as much as airsoft does, because that puts an entire secondary industry at risk.
Yeah, 100%, man. And actually, let me just sort of lay this out. There's an important point you just sort of maybe alluded to. And for our American viewers or anybody outside of Canada, this is a very important point to understand about Canadian firearms law. As opposed to the United States, which defines a firearm as which that shoots a projectile via a combustible explosion, essentially. Okay? So a bullet has to be shot out of a gun using an explosion via gunpowder to be a gun. Okay? In Canada, it has nothing to do with the actual composition or method of propellant. It has everything to do with the speed and force of a projectile leaving any object. And when I mean any object, I mean if you shoot a projectile out of a slingshot fast enough, technically in Canada, it can one day grow up to be a gun.
So by that definition, if I had the lung capacity and I could get a spitball moving out of a straw fast enough, I could be breaking the law.
Matt, it would not surprise me based on current events in Canada that if that could be possibly humanly possible for you, that you would be outlawed or banned in Canada one day.
Right. Okay. Right.
So yes, going back to that, right? The opposite side of this is that also let's wrap our heads around this. Okay. I've called out, obviously airsoft is major in this, paintball, like mag-fed paintball, right? Like again, the whole clause in C-21 specifically about this is if the proposed item doesn't shoot hot enough to be considered a firearm, and it also looks like a real representation of a real world firearm, right? So again, an AEG looks like a real AR-M4, so that's a problem. If it was a space gun, it wouldn't be a problem. If it's an antique gun, like a flintlock, it wouldn't be a problem because we have a clause for antique firearms. But the thing that a lot of people don't the thing to kind of extend this to, just to fully understand kind of a little bit of the ridiculousness of this, is that by eliminating that mid-velocity sort of range, right? Like we're also including, like we all grew up like shooting like Daisy BB guns, like the lever action, like BB guns. Like that is a close enough representation to a real world firearm, or at least from a law enforcement perspective, right? Like it looks like any lever action rifle. So we're literally talking about like things that kids have played with for like now almost 100 years with relatively no problems. Like obviously, has eyes been shot out of at some point in time? I imagine so. Right, there's scary stories all the time, but it's not like we're piling bodies up because of some kid using a BB gun in his backyard, right? So it is kind of far reaching. It's not just the airsoft portion of this, right?
Right. Well, so it's also interesting the specific number distinction makes it very, very limited, not only in terms of the looks, but also because anything above 500 FPS is a real firearm. So even if you tried to get around the restriction by boosting your FPS on your airsoft gun above 500, it then is classified as a real firearm, and then you can't take it to play.
Right, exactly. Well, guess what exists in our firearms code right now? And rightly so is there, right? But there's a clause, there's a well-established law in our firearms law that one commits an offense if they point a firearm, loaded or unloaded, at another person in Canada. Right. So even if you try to skirt around that, the moment you pointed that at somebody, you're immediately a federal criminal. Right. And we're talking like, dude, like potentially a 14-year-old kid. You know what I mean? Like, it's a little like, again, I can see, maybe we'll get into this a little bit more in a second here, right? Like I can see where the logic is dreamed up, right? Like I get it. Like if we follow this along at its most basic level, right? Again, C-21 is about firearms.
Right. And that's a big part of it, right? Because it's not like the lawmakers are sitting there going, oh, we've got to get rid of airsoft. There's a bigger picture here. And unfortunately, we're just the victims on the side.
Right, exactly.
I say exactly because I feel for Canadians, but we went through this here in California.
Well, and let's be honest, man. Like, and all jokes aside about the we support Canada, that sort of thing, right? But like, there is a real effect, and I mean even past Canadians. So let's talk about real effect, right? Like, so let me handle Canada first, just because obviously I'm Canadian. That's what's probably most important to me, right? That's the whole reason we're talking about this stuff. We're not talking about, okay, really the enjoyment of some 12-year-old kid getting into social activities and he doesn't like football or she doesn't like hockey and they want to play something like airsoft, right? Like, yes, ultimately we are talking about the eventual death of that activity. Okay. Right. Because really that's what this is about. This whole prohibition on the replica firearm thing in terms of airsoft or mid-velocity air rifles, it really is, okay, and this is an important nuance, at least the best we can interpret the law right now, from the Canadian standpoint, it's really only on the import, sale, or transfer. Okay, so what the government has been currently saying is that, myself, but let's really take me out of this because I'm almost 40 years old, right? I could just suck it up and grow up. But let's talk about Timmy. Let's talk about Timmy or Tammy, who are 13, 14, 15 years old, okay? They get to keep their airsoft guns, and let's pretend they can even continue to shoot at their friends without going to federal prison, right? Like, let's just pretend that doesn't cross over into firearms law as it dictates the whole pointing thing of a real firearm. Let's say they still get to play. Okay, Timmy's gun breaks. No import, sale, or transfer. You can't give the gun to the store to fix. The store can't bring in parts or guns to sell. Those stores which rely on those funds generally then feed a lot of those funds or income into fields, because generally the two are intermixed, right? Like there's very rare times that we have a standalone store with no connection to any field and vice versa. The two do not survive in a modern landscape separated, right? So while Timmy and Tammy get to keep shooting each other in the backyard, 6, 12 months, 18 months down the road, when all the fields have gone out of business, when all the stores have started to go out of business, there won't be an activity to continue.
Right. It's restriction through limitation.
Yeah. It's exactly it. Right. It's that whole concept of, we're not banning it. We're just going to ensure it dies so we don't have to ban it. Yeah. Now, again, it's not to do with the fact that the government's sitting here going, them damn airsofters. Okay. Yeah. It really comes down to, there's a lot of stuff in pop culture these days, political culture, societal culture, that is about firearms. And we see that across North America. It's not a Canadian, it's not an American issue. We each have our own independent issues with those topics.
And unfortunately, for all of the good that airsoft does and for all of the wonderful things it does as a hobby for people, there is an element of the product that gets misused, and that's what bills like this are aiming to correct, is to keep the population safer by limiting access to products that can potentially be misused in crimes or with violence.
Correct. That's absolutely correct. And I do like the fact that you use the word, aims to correct the potential of, or things like that. Because again, I mean, banning replica firearms is merely just to support this idea in Canada that if we ban ARs, right, and other semi-autos, that's a weird legal landscape to in that sort of environment allow these things that look exactly like those dangerous things we've just banned to also exist. Like, that's a legal liability that no federal, provincial, or state, for you guys, or municipal government's going to want to have on their plate, right? Like, at all. Like, you're going to have kids getting pulled over and literally probably accosted by police officers who know no different because they're just like, hey, I know this thing's illegal, but this kid's got one.
Yeah, you're just signing up for lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit. They may not go anywhere, but the state doesn't want to, or the government doesn't want to pay for all the litigation that comes with it. So they're doing a blanket.
Exactly. They're just saying we're going to close that window because trust me, it saves us a lot of problems when we're trying to roll this other stuff out, right? And that's where the problem lies. Is that unfortunately, when the stuff in California was going down, like at least it was an attack on just airsoft. Like, airsoft could mount a defense because it was an attack on airsoft. You could line up data and have people hear, right? A bill like this, like I said, it's because it surrounds firearms and it just so happens to touch airsoft and paintball and all that fun stuff via this replica firearms thing. Is that it's hard to argue from an airsofter's perspective, because rightly so, from an airsoft perspective, these replica firearms called airsoft or whatever, they're not really dangerous. They don't hurt people unless you go out of your way to be unsafe with them, right? Like if you're wearing goggles and a face mesh, literally you cannot hurt yourself, right? It just stings.
And it's also you don't want to sit there and try to argue with somebody about whether or not the slight difference in shape of this product is a close enough silhouette to a real firearm that it justifies its use or validates its use.
That's the problem here. That's the problem because, here, I'll give the easy answer. Okay, if everybody in the airsoft community, Canada, worldwide, whatever, wanted to just go, guess what? We're just all going to use space guns for now. Now going forward, guess what? Sure. Problem over.
Sure. We could all
it's not airsoft.
Nerf guns. Well, and Nerf guns would be fine.
With 798, that was kind of the middle ground. Was okay. Everything's just going to be neon colored now,
right?
And then ironically, the firearm world started going that way, kind of anyway, with making things really unique and cool colors.
Well, and that was the big difference between 199, 798, and what's going on with C-21 is that was more to do with coloration and safety rather than an outright restriction or ban of the product. Effectively, they accomplish a similar goal, but yeah.
Well, and that's sort of actually some of the sort of direction that the Canadian movement is
suggesting.
I guess going right. Yeah, sure. Going right now, right? Is this?
If you let us keep it, we'll paint them green.
Right. Something to that nature, right? It's a very back against the wall stance, rightly so. Again, I'm just saying this stuff as factual. I'm neutral on what my stance is on the correct strategy here, right? But it is very much that, where I guess the airsoft community in Canada is very open to having a conversation rather than this thing going through in a bill where we have zero control, right? And that's where we currently stand.
It's that situation where there's a speeding train coming towards you. You're stuck on a track. Would you rather be tied down to it or have a running chance to outrun it? Right. You're not getting off the track. It's just where do you want to be? Yeah.
Exactly it. So, Robo, really quick, do you want to touch on what Canadians can do about this?
Absolutely. Beyond just being a good citizen in Canada, and what I mean by that is being on top of the political matters and all that fun stuff. And if you're that type of person as a Canadian, I hope you've seen, you've read Bill C-21. I hope you've seen maybe in the last day, the official parliamentary petition against C-21 has hit the market.
Although by the time you're seeing this, it's probably yesterday or 2 days ago.
Yeah. By the time you've seen this, Future Rob is telling you, past people, that it happened already. But in any case, there is a movement here in Canada. So I'm I guess willing to I guess kind of extend my full support to a big group of airsoft community members. They're all very close friends of mine. They've started a movement which is called on Facebook. It's called Airsoft in Canada. Okay. The web address for that, the actual website is savingairsoft.ca. And what it is it's an informational website that seeks to educate people, the general public, what airsoft is, its effect on communities. Okay. And what I mean by that is, again, shy kids in high school that don't have, tribes to call their own. And I hate, for anybody that actually doesn't know me from when I was a kid, and that's most of you guys, like that was my, like, regardless of how you see me on some camera or in some YouTube video or in some picture from some airsoft event. Okay. I grew up being that kid who didn't really have a tribe in high school and into my 20s. And airsoft for me was that. Okay. So, this whole movement of showing the regular public, the parents that have kids that airsoft, that maybe those parents aren't gun fans, but are impartial or would be at least more concerned about the happiness of their kids over the banning of a toy gun, right? Like we want to, it aims to inform those people of the positive effects of what airsoft is, why it's not a public threat. And more so, it also points out the overall sort of non-logic of legislation like C-21. Okay. And that's the real problem. I mean, all the stuff in C-21, including airsoft, if it could be or would be supported by empirical data that actually said that there was a problem, then there's no issue with the bill. But taking the example of airsoft and banning that because, that looks like a real gun and therefore maybe one day some cop in Canada will shoot a kid holding it. Well, that's not something that's happened yet. And there is no data that supports a deluge of public safety events that necessitates this type of lawmaking. So it's a site that has compiled all of that information, and more so, and this is the important bit, and what I want to kind of say to fellow Canadians, and I appreciate you guys at Evike supporting me coming on here to talk about this, and that is, it's also compiled the effect on the actual industry. The first 4 days of the website being up, like hundreds of businesses across Canada had signed up in support of saying we're a business that's affected. We're looking at hundreds of businesses, thousands of employees that would literally lose jobs overnight if something like this passed. And these things matter when we're looking at legislation like this. Right. It's not about just the words in the bill. Okay. It's about what is the positive effect on society, and in achieving that positive effect, or in not achieving a positive effect, what are the consequences, right? And that's the risk equation we all play in our modern democratic societies, right? Do we put money towards cancer research? Well, if there's a lot of cancer, we put more money towards it. If the water treatment plant is working perfectly, we maybe lower its budget, right? That's how stuff works. So it aims to kind of ask that question: is banning airsoft going to be a good return of investment in public safety versus the number of kids, businesses, and employees that it has a drastic effect on, right?
So if you want to learn more as a viewer, if you want more information, if you want to get involved, there are a ton of resources and a ton of airsofters in the community all producing videos like this, explaining what the bill is, and really doing outreach to make sure that the community up in Canada is as strong as it possibly can be to oppose legislation like this. We're going to post links to the websites and information that Robo referred to, as well as kind of a breakdown. Specific sections of Section 84 in C-21 are in the description below.
Really quick, thanks Robo for coming onto our little broadcast here and talking about the bill as best we could. Thank you for bearing with us during our technical difficulties, and we will post all of the links to everything that you can do as a Canadian citizen. Get people involved. If you are under the voting age, get your parents involved. Do whatever you got to do to get involved. Grassroots movements can help change things. We changed 798. We did that here in California with 798 that we talked about earlier. So it's very important that we have hope and that we just all band together and work as best as we can. So thanks, Robo, for coming on, and we'll post all those links in the description below.
Perfect. I appreciate it too, guys. And one last thing to leave you guys with, and I want to extend this heartfelt for you, I guess, towards you guys. And I just want to, not speak for all Canadians, but I really do. And I think the entire community appreciates the attention that not just Canadians are giving this, right? Like we are a community. I think it's one of the biggest things I've ever learned from Airsoft. And that is, on my deathbed, I will admit to people that the best people I've ever encountered on this planet Earth is through my adventures in Airsoft. And that sounds crazy, but it's not. So it really means a lot to us that even you guys are taking notice and trying to help us, however that is. So I just really want to appreciate you even having me on. Okay. I appreciate it, guys.
So, leaving on a closing note and bookending this, talking about what we talked about earlier is this, even though this only affects Canadian airsoft in Canada right now, in terms of this specific bill, this kind of messaging and this kind of thing is something we need to be aware of at all times, whether you're in the United States or Europe or anywhere. It's very important that we all band together as a community, because it is a worldwide industry and it is a worldwide hobby. And like Robo said, like, some of the best experiences and best friendships are made from this sport and hobby. So it's very important that we pay attention to, just because it's not in our backyard doesn't mean that we can't do something about it or pay attention to it. So we're going to leave you with that. Follow the links in the description below if you want to find out more information. Do what you can to get involved, anytime something like this comes up. So thank you all for watching, and we'll see you again soon.